There are many stories in Hollywood, some of which are buried for decades and others of which are told too soon. However, the business was quietly rocked when Audrey Meadows eventually made the decision to talk about Jackie Gleason. She had been known for years as the cool-headed lady who starred opposite one of the noisiest and most erratic celebrities on television. Audrey played Alice Kramden on The Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason's patient wife to his irascible bluster and the voice of reason to his character, Ralph. I meant every word, Alice. I would have stated more, but the record was too little. However, I meant every word. Ralph, you said enough. I had the notion. They appeared to have an almost ideal chemistry. However, there was something quite different and unsaid going on underneath those faultless performances. Audrey was aware of the reality, but she kept it to herself for many years. She had a motive. Speaking up could have cost her everything in a time when women in entertainment were frequently expected to keep quiet and smile. She also decided to preserve the myth for a long time, not just for Jackie but also for the millions of fans who still thought the Honeymooners were hilarious. A blabbermouth once is a blabbermouth forever. Well, Ralph, let me tell you something. I'm very happy you sent me this record because I now understand your true feelings. In private, however, she rarely told anybody about her other narrative. Not with the media, not with fans, and not even with close co-workers. Then, at the age of 73, she finally spoke up. She revealed herself in a way she had never done before in a number of interviews and private messages. What did she say? It permanently altered the public's perception of Jackie Gleason. It was neither a public attack nor a spectacular tell-all. It was honest, but Audrey never had that kind of flair. Powerfully, quietly honest. She described what it was like to work next to a man who was demanding, whose temper could turn a set into a battlefield, and who, despite his genius, left his closest friends and family with permanent scars. Yes, there was a great deal of love. However, the location was uninteresting. The light bulbs lacked brightness. Why was she silent for so long? What actually went on behind the scenes of one of the most popular comedies on television? What was Audrey Meadows' actual opinion of the man who was referred to as the Great One? You may be surprised by the answers, which start with what viewers never saw. Audrey Meadows and Jackie Gleason were the epitome of opposites to the millions of Americans who watched television during its heyday. She was the grounded, quick-witted Alice. He was the big-hearted, explosive Ralph. On The Honeymooners, a sitcom that seemed incredibly authentic, they worked together to create magic. It appeared as though they were actually married since they were so unguarded. The reality, however, was much less cozy and much more nuanced. There were hints that things might not be as easy as they appeared on film as soon as Audrey joined the cast. By the time The Honeymooners became a standalone program, Jackie Gleason was already a big star and wasn't known for getting along with other people. In actuality, Jackie flatly turned Audrey down when she tried out. She appeared too sophisticated, in his opinion. Too sophisticated to portray a housewife from the working class. He finally consented to give her a chance when she had a photographer shoot shots of her wearing a cheap home coat, her hair disheveled, and her makeup off. This would be his show, on his terms, even back then. Had the worst act in entertainment, John. It was awful. Although Audrey was not a softie, she was astute enough to recognize the political dynamics at work. Jackie was in charge of the tone, the directing, and the scripting. Not a single line was altered without his consent. The cast frequently made jokes about how working with him was like entering a one-man kingdom where Jackie's voice was the only thing that really counted. That required Audrey to tread extremely carefully. She needed to be quick, witty, and firm without being too loud or aggressive to overpower Jackie or to undermine his authority. Nevertheless, the friction between them was what made their performances so memorable. Audrey was capable of taking care of herself. In sharp contrast to Jackie's flamboyant demeanor, she possessed a quiet strength, a dramatic background, and a sharp sense of timing. She had a sincerity that comes from dissatisfaction in real life when she made those incisive comebacks. They were far from being close off camera, unlike what some thought. Actually, unless it was about work, the two rarely spoke. Once the lights went down, there were no shared chuckles or hot dinners. And the emotional toll started to mount over time. People assume we had chemistry because we liked each other, Audrey told a friend in one of our rare moments together. We didn't, therefore it worked. What viewers witnessed was a skillfully constructed illusion that concealed the tension that was seething beneath the surface. Audrey found it increasingly difficult to sustain that illusion as the Honeymooners' popularity soared. However, the following part of her story would bring her even closer to the brink if she felt it was challenging. The people behind the scenes were not laughing at all, despite the fact that viewers were amused by Ralph Kramden's exaggerated tirades and theatrical gestures. Jackie Gleason was famous for having a bad temper. The same passion that drove his legendary performances also produced a workplace rife with trepidation, uncertainty, and silent fear. It was like walking a tightrope for Audrey Meadows. Without a safety net. Jackie insisted on having total authority over the entire production process. Scenes were frequently shot in a single take, regardless of how clumsy, because he did not think it was necessary to practice much. Someone could react explosively if he missed a cue or fumbled a line. The entire set would fall silent when Jackie would suddenly strike out, according to a number of the actors and crew. The poor guy keeps trying even though he doesn't have a lot of talent. Years later, one crew member recounted it. It was palpable in the air. Everyone would tense up as soon as Jackie entered. You could never tell what kind of mood he was in. Everything was infused with that fear. The directors were wary. Authors were obedient. Actors, Audrey in particular, have to be careful around his moods. A small argument could escalate into a brawl. A mere suggestion could provoke outright animosity. Audrey did the best she could at handling it. She was competent, patient, and well prepared at all times. She was not exempt from Jackie's anger, though. On certain days, he would critique her performance in front of the entire cast and refuse to look at her in between scenes. The following day, he would act as though nothing had happened. It was an emotional manipulation roller coaster. It was also somewhat draining for someone like Audrey, who appreciated discipline and deference. She acknowledged in private that she frequently felt like she had to tread carefully. An entire shoot may be ruined by one mistake, or worse, a falling out that would last forever. Nevertheless, she remained. She believed in the work, not because she wanted to. She refused to allow Jackie's actions to deprive her of her own performance because she understood the Honeymooners were something unique and adored by the public. No official support structure existed, and she had no one to confide in without jeopardizing her career. She told herself that it would all be worthwhile in the end, and she endured it with silent fortitude. But she knew in her heart that the price was already mounting. Even Audrey Meadows had a breaking point, a time when being mute no longer seemed like the honorable thing to do, even though she had maintained her calm for so long. Audrey Meadows appeared unflappable to the general public. She was intelligent, calm, and always had the final say in her role on the Honeymooners. She had a similar position in real life, but the stakes were far larger. Additionally, he is a gentleman, which you seem to have completely forgotten about. Audrey had a weight off camera that not many were aware of. It was emotionally taxing to work with Jackie Gleason, but she never showed it. Not during public gatherings, not during interviews, and not even when prodded by reporters who are eager to spread rumors. She kept the reality firmly hidden behind her composed facade. It was more than just self-defense. Audrey was aware of the significance of the Honeymooners. After a tough day, working-class families had something to chuckle about thanks to the show. It was realistic, humorous, and relatable. Furthermore, she was afraid that removing the curtain might ruin the illusion. Thus, rather of raising her voice, she defended the fiction. She grinned. In speeches, she acknowledged Jackie. She also didn't talk about her deeper emotions. However, the emotional toll was growing behind closed doors. Friends and relatives claim that Audrey frequently confided in them about the true difficulty of the job environment. She talked of Jackie's mood swings, the anxiety of not knowing how each day would turn out, and the intense loneliness that resulted from acting as though nothing was wrong. She thought about leaving at times, but it was difficult to turn down a national smash. Knowing how important she was to the show, CBS officials urged her to stay, telling her that their chemistry was like lightning in a bottle. Audrey made the strategic choice to remain silent rather than out of weakness. She recognized the time period in which she lived. Actresses who spoke their opinions in the 1950s were frequently branded as tough, and their careers soon came to a standstill. Audrey wasn't going to allow that to happen. Thus, both on and off screen, she persevered, adjusted, and fulfilled her role. She never really recovered from the emotional burden of those years, though. After the Honeymooners, she threw herself into various endeavors, frequently selecting positions that offered her greater stability and creative freedom. However, friends claimed that the wounds from her time working with Jackie Gleason were still present decades later. According to a close friend, Audrey would occasionally get silent when his name was mentioned, her face slightly tensing as if recalling something she had tried so hard to forget. She continued to be devoted to the program and its history, but at a personal cost. And as time passed, she started to question if it had been the proper decision to preserve those secrets. It was not resentment that ultimately prompted her to speak up. Clarity was the key. And at 73, Audrey was at last prepared to speak the truth. To restore her position in the past, not to destroy it. After decades of contemplation, Audrey Meadows ultimately made the decision to reveal what had been bothering her for decades. She opened out in a way she had never done before at the age of 73, long after the lights had gone out and the audience had stopped cheering. Quiet moments of candor were interspersed with personal letters, late career interviews, and a memoir that said a lot without resorting to a controversial book tour or a headline-grabbing interview. Audrey let herself talk openly about Jackie Gleason for the first time. The man behind the bluster, not just the act. She also did not sugarcoat the reality, even though she never intended to ruin his legacy. Yes, she said, he was a genius, but he was also a bully. The screen was illuminated by the talent of a man, but whose off-camera presence might be oppressive. Excuse me, John. Indeed, she remembered times when she felt more like a prop than a partner, when his anger would suddenly flare up, and when the atmosphere on set became icy with terror. She claimed in a rare interview that she could be amiable and giving 1 minute and intolerable the next. She talked on how draining it was to never know what Jackie version she might run into every day. Occasionally, he would warmly and honestly praise her performance. At other times, he would yell at her over a petty issue or completely ignore her. She had to endure that emotional whiplash in silence for the sake of the show, and it became a part of her routine. Her remarks' moderation was what gave them their potency. Audrey never took pleasure in bringing others down. There was no retaliation or bitterness in her interpretation of the facts. Experience served as its foundation. She recognized Jackie's importance to others. She understood that behind every great guy, there is usually someone quietly suffering the damage left behind, but she had also seen audiences light up whenever his name was mentioned. We made history, but at a cost, she said in her memoir. For her, the cost included years of acting as though nothing was wrong, self-censorship, and emotional weariness. But by speaking up at last, she allowed herself and innumerable others to share their tales without fear of rejection or condemnation. Fans' perceptions of the Honeymooners were altered by her remarks. For the first time, viewers saw that the enchantment of the show was based on conflict rather than camaraderie. And if that realization may have made the nostalgia more difficult, it also gave a long black and white story. More nuance. Audrey wasn't finished, though. She unveiled a side of herself and Jackie that few had ever seen as she continued to peel back layers. The Honeymooners' impact is deeply ingrained in American television culture. It is frequently praised for being classic, ageless, and masterfully crafted. However, the majority of fans were unaware that something considerably more brittle than flawless performances or writing drove its enduring appeal. Tension was the cause. Tension that was genuine, unresolved, and ongoing between two people who never really trusted each other yet shared a screen. Jackie Gleason's demanding personality did not only affect Audrey Meadows. Stagehands, writers, and even producers would frequently tread carefully on his emotions. But the brunt of it fell on Audrey, his on-screen wife. She had to absorb his frequent mood fluctuations while remaining calm and prepared for the camera, offer witty comic lines without making him feel proud, and equal his enthusiasm without overpowering him. Her role involved much more than just acting, in many respects. It took emotional fortitude. Later on, Audrey would consider that interaction with a mixture of sadness and clarity. She acknowledged that there was no denying their on-screen chemistry, but not because they were attracted to one another. It was as a result of their continuous response to the friction underneath the surface. Jackie remained vigilant due to her unpredictable nature. Her cool, collected performance brought his turmoil under control. Sometimes, what fans saw as light-hearted banter turned out to be a very real tug-of-war between two strong forces with diametrically opposed morals. She never acted as though Jackie was untalented. Instead, she frequently referred to him as one of the most innately talented actors she had ever collaborated with. However, she added that his genius came at a high price. One minute he was toasty, the next he was freezing. With a sentence that was just right, he made her chuckle. Just to chastise her for a small argument in private hours later. Every day of filming felt like a gamble because of that mental instability. Ironically, though, that very conflict contributed to the show's historical significance. Fans loved the realism because of the unadulterated intensity, the somewhat strained delivery, and the sensation that anything may happen at any time. In addition to humor, their scenes were brimming with unsaid tension. It seemed authentic because of that. Too authentic. According to Audrey, their performances were successful because we were never able to get close enough to feel at ease. It is a claim that alters one's perspective on the entire series. What appeared to be flawless casting was actually a fine balance between self-defense and trust, power and restraint. Lightning in a bottle was the show. But no matter how heavy the bottle got, someone had to hold it steady after catching that lightning. And even after the cameras stopped rolling, Audrey continued to feel the effects of that performance. What she kept to herself would ultimately influence how she bid farewell to Jackie in a whole phase of her life. Tributes to Jackie Gleason came from all throughout the nation after her death in 1987. He was regarded as a trailblazer, a unique talent, and a man whose presence and timing contributed to the foundation of television humor. However, his death sparked something much more intricate and intimate for Audrey Meadows. She respectfully and silently went to his burial. It was a quiet farewell to a man who had once been the focus of her professional life. There were no big announcements or press coverage from her visit. Audrey later acknowledged in interviews with close friends that she had a peculiar sense of calm when she said farewell. "I never forgot, but I forgave him," she said. Everything that she had never stated aloud was encapsulated in that one sentence. Memory did not make the past more bearable, and forgiveness did not make the hurt go away. However, Audrey opted for introspection over bitterness in her final years. She never attempted to change the past. Rather, she tried to comprehend it. Professionally, she understood that she had earned a spot in television history thanks to the Honeymooners. It made doors open. It made her famous for life. However, for me, the event created scars that would not go away with time. The role gave her everything, she once admitted to a family member. Aside from mental tranquility. Neither throughout her acting career nor in retirement did she completely let go of the strain. She was always restrained in her public remarks about Jackie. She would appreciate his contribution to comedy, reminisce about a humorous event on set, or praise his talent. However, a lifetime of emotional calculation lay beneath that elegance. Audrey was aware of the importance of her appearance. Saying too much too soon would have drawn attention to the controversy around her work rather than her work itself. So she waited. Constantly conscious of the impact of her words, she carefully considered them. The world had changed by the time she started to talk more openly in her 70s. The stories of women who had been silent for too long were finally being heard. Her voice became part of an expanding chorus of artists, authors, and performers who had faced comparable difficulties at a time when speaking up had severe repercussions. Was her narrative one of redemption? Maybe. In order to be recognized not only as Alice Kramden but also as a woman who had persevered, adjusted, and survived one of the most challenging working dynamics in vintage television, she lived long enough to speak the truth on her own terms. Were there regrets? Perhaps. If there was, Audrey refused to let it define who she was. She had learned to breathe in anguish and pride simultaneously. By doing this, she created her own legacy, one that is based on quiet tenacity as much as performances. Audrey Meadows carried the burden of someone else's legacy for a large portion of her life. She contributed to its construction, defense, and operation. And she didn't intend to destroy that legacy when she eventually spoke the truth. She wanted to regain her voice in it. Her revelations regarding Jackie Gleason were intended to balance the record rather than to shock or scandalize. Because one narrative had been recounted for decades while hers had not. She demonstrated to the world that there are occasionally unstated costs associated with on-screen greatness. That there may be injuries hidden behind the laughter and acclaim. Her truth has nothing to do with revenge. It was about realizing, about letting the stillness go at last. Audrey's choice to speak up was ultimately a silent act of courage. She kept her truth to herself. After being advised to keep quiet all her life, she finally whispered it. She also served as a reminder to everyone that even the best performers can be overpowered. That honesty can come decades later and still be important, and that dignity does not imply silence. The great one, Jackie Gleason, will never be forgotten. There was no denying his brilliance. However, Audrey also serves as a reminder that greatness is not always nice and that cruelty is rarely justified by brilliance. She demonstrated to us how the personal stories behind celebrity continue to develop long after the limelight has faded. They breathe, they grow, and they are worthy of being heard. It is natural for viewers to romanticize the heyday of television and see it as a simpler, more joyful era. However, Audrey eventually disclosed that the truth is far more nuanced. The stars, no matter how adored, were frequently fighting demons just out of frame, the sets were not always happy, and the pairings were not always equal. There was more to Audrey Meadows than words and laughter. She left a lesson in her wake. That quiet isn't always ideal. That it may be liberating to speak the truth on your own terms, and that often the most impactful performances take place when the cameras are not filming. Even in her 70s, her voice remained clear and steady, serving as the epilogue to a tale that millions of people believed they already knew. And Audrey Meadows did something she had never been permitted to do at the height of her celebrity in that last act. She stepped forth as herself, not as a character.